and we'll just have to live with that. Not a lot to do with that, Andy. Right, let me tell you about Andy Thomas, for those who didn't hear me earlier. Andy Thomas is a well-known British author. He has lectured overseas on many subjects, and I saw his presentation about a year ago, and I thought it was one of the best, what I would call, introductions about the world of conspiracy, and we're all supposed to be Looney Tunes. Well, for me, in reality, the people who are open to look at a conspiracy are the ones who have got an open mind, who are not afraid to lift the veil and lift the blinkers. And unfortunately, when you do that on a number of subjects, you start to see some legitimate questions that are not asked and never answered. Okay? So on that note, when I saw Andy Thomas's lecture, I was very, very impressed. He was very experienced, but I was very impressed with his PowerPoint, and I went up to him straight away and said, look, I want you to launch my 2-day conference because I think that sets up the rest of the UFO-related program. This PowerPoint that he's going to do, very slick, is not just about UFOs, but it talks about UFOs and other conspiracies. But it sets us up for our 2 days, and for those who have never been to a UFO conference, and this was in the thought in the back of my mind, I wanted you to have a bit of an introduction that the people who claim that we're all Looney Tunes are actually the ones who have got a closed mind, and all the people in this room, because you're here, clearly have an open mind. And that's all I ask, is that you have an open mind and be ready to receive information. You do with it what you want. It's not preaching. But on that note, put your hands together for Andy Thomas.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. Well done for getting in on time. Very good. So what I want to do this morning, as Gary's just given you an idea, is to give some context to the kind of stuff that we're going to be hearing about over the weekend. Because we, in the world of investigating, if you like, unexplained mysteries, which UFOs are generally categorised under, we generally get a hard time. And the notion that somebody up at the top is keeping the truth from those of us a little bit further down the bottom, as they will perceive it, is of course something which has long roots. It's not a modern thing. And the eye that we see here, of course, will be better known to you in the main image you see here. This is the Eye of Providence, and it's a Masonic symbol. It was created in 1776, and it was seen by the Masons as a very positive symbol. And they saw this as the divine being at the top, looking after the then 13 states of America. But of course, there's another interpretation that you can put on this. There are many, many layers to the occult meaning to this symbol that we don't have the time for today. But in the world of conspiracy theory, they look at this, let's say we, and by the way, I have no issue with the word conspiracy theory. I know there are some people in this room who do, but to me, there are conspiracies. Some we know something of the truth of, others we need to theorise. What is wrong with being a conspiracy theorist, I would ask. So, in the world of conspiracy thinking, let's call it that, this is seen as evil. This denotes those at the top, the all-seeing eye, and they've got us trapped in the pyramid below. And yet we don't even know that we're trapped in that pyramid, or most of us don't. Those that can step out slightly and look backwards in, then of course you get a new perspective. But the problem is, so many people are still in the pyramid. The mission of all of those that can see the wider picture is to bring them out, so they can look in and see exactly what system they are trapped within. Now, we're going to be hearing, of course, much this weekend about the UFO phenomenon and related matters. And I am, for the most part, going to leave that to the other speakers. But it is interesting, when I discuss UFOs at my lectures, and I often lecture to all kinds of groups, mainstream as well as truth-seeker groups, what I get when I show a picture of a flying saucer or anything of this ilk is a ripple of laughter. Have you ever noticed that? You get a ripple of laughter goes through the room. And I will usually then challenge them with, why are you laughing? And actually, they don't know. And the reason they're laughing is they've been programmed to laugh. Because, of course, a stigma has been created in our wider society around issues like this, so that it shuts down a public conversation. The more people are trained to laugh at the notion of UFOs, extraterrestrials, and all the rest of it, then, of course, the less they're going to speak about it in the public domain. And that concerns me, because it's very clear, as most of you here know, that there is certainly something rather serious going on, whatever you choose to think that something is. So we, therefore, in the world of this kind of research, have a core belief that the truth is being withheld from the public. And, of course, it seems blindingly obvious once you look at the evidence. But those on the outside, they still don't necessarily see it like that. And beyond the world of UFOs, I mean, of course, any mainstream story, whether it be about Brexit, ISIS, the new Cold War, or indeed the terror attacks we've seen across Europe in the last couple of years. Now, in the mainstream, you will get one version of what that all means. And yet, you can go online, of course, and you can find 100 other versions, maybe 1,000 other versions. And yet very often, they will seem to have as much credibility as the evidence being presented in the mainstream. And yet this is not presented to the majority of people. Now, the internet, for all the downside of it, has been a wonderful tool for sharing information. And we should never, I think, take for granted the window that that has opened up. But therefore, you need to show people a context for why it is that there is more than likely a dedicated program to keep the public stupid. And one way of doing that is to look back through history, because conspiracy thinking is not new. And many of you will know this, but it's worth looking back at the roots of modern day conspiracy theory. And to do that, we need to look back a little bit through the centuries, and then mainly perhaps at the last century or so, because you can see clear patterns emerging where absolutely either the truth was withheld, or worse, it was twisted, it was warped, and usually people die in the process of this. So that's what we're going to look at today. And let's go back, way back, to the Roman Empire. Now, when you look at Roman history, there are many conspiracies over and over, and we don't have the time to go through them all today. Many assassination plots and all the rest of it. But this image here, in a way, sums up the world of conspiracy thinking. Because here we see the Emperor Nero, and Nero is playing the lyre, not fiddling, that's a mistranslation. He was playing the lyre while Rome burned around him. Why? Because it was widely believed at the time that actually Nero had given the orders to torch Rome in the Great Fire of Rome. Now, on the Palatine Hill, there were many palaces built there, and Nero didn't like this very much because they were in the way of where he wanted to build his own palace. So when, of course, they all caught fire, that was rather convenient. But, of course, what Nero did was then blame the minority that were around at the time, which was the early Christians. So the Christians were blamed for the fire and, of course, were put to torture and indeed to death. So this is the normal state of affairs. It sums everything up, really. Somebody at the top doing something dubious, blaming those at the bottom, distracting the public. And yet, you look back at the old Roman writings, and very clearly it was widely believed that Nero himself had given the orders to torch the city. And there's many things in Roman history that really are much the same as what we have today. That phrase, the false flag conspiracy, comes from ancient times, and the Romans and the Greeks and other civilizations would either hijack the ships of the enemy or would dress their own ships up in the colours of the enemy and then attack their own fleet, thus making it, of course, look like the enemy had done it. and thus justifying the mandate of all the wars and all the, horrific things they could then go and do to the enemy. So this has become known as the false flag attack, and it still goes on today, of course. Perhaps not quite so obviously as this, although yet sometimes it is almost as obvious as this. So we can see here things that, some would say in modern conspiracy thinking really are far from it. And what were the Romans trying to do anyway? They were trying to unify the world that they knew. And here is the Roman Empire. There was the Roman Empire. Let's go back. The Roman Empire. It looks small to us today, but it was certainly in its day a major achievement to unify this much of the world that they knew. And many civilizations since, including, I might add, some of the minds behind the EU, would love to recreate the Roman Empire and indeed beyond. And of course, we here in our own country, we didn't do too badly, did we? All the pink bits, once upon a time, were ruled by the British Empire. So there have been many civilizations that have looked back and thought, you know what, if we could unify the world under a collective power, giving a lot of power to relatively few hands, then what a wonderful world it would be. And then they, of course, would get their way and everybody else would be under their control. So there's lots of people around in the world today who are powerful that still think that this is a good idea. And we sometimes hear this project referred to as the New World Order. And as we'll see in a minute, the New World Order is not some conspiracy fantasy. It is a real project, and you can trace the origins of it very clearly. So we could speak forever about historical conspiracies. I mean, in the Elizabethan times, they had something in common with where we are today. Britain, through Henry VIII, had split with Rome. It split apart from the rule of Europe. And of course, many of the countries in Europe were not very happy about this. And of course, then it was expressed through Catholicism. And we had the Armada and various attempts to unseat this new independent country on the shores now of Europe. So it has something in common with these times. And there were therefore various attempts to get rid of Elizabeth and any of the Protestant kings and queens and take away the new sovereignty that we had created. And I'll just focus on one plot today, right at the end of Elizabeth's reign. When she was very elderly, in 1601, the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, led a rebellion into London to basically restore his prestige at court. There wasn't any great ethos behind it. And it was defeated and he lost his head. But one of the survivors of this rebellion went on to become something of a name in a plot that you will have heard of. Because one of the survivors was a man called Robert Catesby, and Catesby became one of the gunpowder plotters and indeed was one of the ringleaders. Because of course, in 1605, Catholicism was not entirely outlawed, but you could not express that faith openly. And there were Catholics who'd been hoping with the rise of James I to the throne that there might be some emancipation. When it became obvious that that was not going to happen, there were various new plots. And the gunpowder plot, of course, which attempted to blow up the king and the parliament on November the 5th, 1605, was one of the more prominent attempts. Now, it got defeated, of course, and was unmasked, but many people in that time believed that actually this was a false flag operation. And there are documents which suggest that perhaps the gunpowder plotters had actually been encouraged to do this by the government of the day so they could be caught in the act and therefore justify more persecution against Catholicism. And some would say this has some resonance with what's going on with all the thinking around 9/11. Which we will of course come to by and by. It's not a modern conspiracy theory. Even at the time, there was a Jesuit priest called John Girard who very widely put this view out there. Girard, as you can see here, was not much liked by the authorities. There he is being tortured on the front of a book. He was in the Tower of London, in fact, being tortured, and yet managed to escape. We don't know to this day how Girard managed to actually do it, but he did, and he fled to France, and he wrote an account of the gunpowder plot in which he clearly told the world this was a setup. And in fact, I'll give you the quote. He wrote, for purposes of state, the government of the day either found means to instigate the conspirators to undertake their enterprise, or at least being, from an early stage of the undertaking, fully aware of what was going on, sedulously nursed the insane scheme till the time came to make capital out of it. So what he's saying there is he didn't approve of the gunpowder plot, but he believes it was encouraged into being by the government of the day. False flag. So these accusations, this way of thinking, certainly is not new. And I mean, shortly after, we had, of course, the English Civil War, and then we had that followed by the Fire of London in 1666. The English Civil Wars were long and bloody and terrible, and many blamed, ultimately, a Catholic-leaning king, Charles I, for having brought this about. He believed he was a divine presence on the earth, and yet, although he was leading the new Church of England, he was seen as basically a secret Catholic. So after the wars, after he had lost his head, there was a deep suspicion of anything to do with Catholicism, and indeed anything that went wrong. So when the Fire of London burnt, a fair proportion of it, and of course it's been the anniversary just in the last week, many people absolutely believe this must be a Catholic arson plot. And one of the characters that encouraged that thinking over the next 10 years was a man called Titus Oates. Now, Titus Oates probably did more damage to the reputation of conspiracy thinking than anybody else in history. He had himself once been a Jesuit priest, but he'd been thrown out and he had a chip on his shoulder. And therefore, he wanted to get his own back. So he basically invented a plot. He said there was a plot to kill the new king, Charles II. And Charles II was actually quite dubious about this, but he thought, well, I can't take the risk, I better go along with this. So Oates was given his own platoon, he went around rounding people up. Something in the region of 30 people died being executed on the say-so of Oates. But of course, in the end, witnesses who'd been paid turned out to be not actually that reliable, and they came forward and said they'd been paid to front this story, and it all unravelled. And Oates wound up in the stocks. But of course, the government of the day looked very stupid, and they'd gone along with a conspiracy theory that had turned out to be a nonsense. And never again would any British government ever officially sanction this kind of conspiracy theory again. And this is something which I think has led to conspiracy theorists being seen as a bit of a pariah in our society. Not, of course, that meant for a minute that conspiracy thinking went away. Indeed, when you get to 1776, you get the foundation of the Illuminati. You'll often hear people say that the ruling elite who run the world are the Illuminati. My suspicion is it doesn't today have very much to do with the original Illuminati, except to say perhaps it did take on some of the ideas. Here are some of the founding members of the Illuminati in Bavaria in 1776, and they created a kind of a government behind the government. They realised they could get their way more easily by working from the shadows instead of being overt. And in the end, they were found out and they were persecuted, and the original Illuminati were disbanded very quickly. But some think that the seeds they sowed, that they carried on. And of course, in the same year, you've got the Eye of Providence, you've got the foundation of these kind of Masonic groups that, of course, have had enormous power over the years. And this is something which, of course, would gradually build up a resentment amongst those who were aware of what was going on, that we were not being told the truth about who really did run the world. You get an interesting moment in the early 20th century where after Balfour, shortly before he would become our Prime Minister, wrote to the then President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. And basically, Balfour could see the way things were going with the British Empire. He knew it was on the wane. He knew it wasn't going to last, but he could also see that America was becoming the new superpower. So he thought, you know what, the way to keep our supremacy is basically to work with America. So he wrote to Roosevelt and said, look, you and I, we know, don't we? Britain and America, we're better than everybody else. The rest are all foreigners. Let's run the world. And that was the essence of the letter. And the scholar Terry Boardman actually puts it rather better. Terry, if you haven't checked out his works on the origins of the New World Order, I urge that you do. Terry writes that what Balfour proposed was, quote, a global Anglo-Saxon confederation that would police the world with the navies of the two countries and through their invincible domination bring eternal peace and prosperity. So this is a clear attempt at saying, let's have a kind of a global hegemony here. And there's every sign that this soon was in place. H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, leading thinkers and authorities of the day were all for this new project that would become known as the New World Order. And Wells even wrote a non-fiction book called The New World Order. And Wells, all right, we'll leave it on this. Wells was absolutely an advocate of things that today look very dubious, like eugenics, and thought this was the way to create a nice, safe world with a ruling elite at the top. Woodrow Wilson in 1913 already seems to be aware that this kind of tier of ruling elite that is not obvious already has power. And he wrote a book called The New Freedom. And in it, he wrote this interesting quote. He said, some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organised, so subtle, so watchful, etc., that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. And he seemed to be trying to warn people that there was this new shadowy tier of rulers that perhaps we ought to know about. But then, of course, Wilson himself became president and then founded the Federal Reserve. So he then became part of the problem because many people believed the Federal Reserve was essentially an entirely illegal organisation. And indeed, our own banking systems here and around the world, when you actually look at the way many of them were set up, they are basically rogue organisations that we think have power, but only because we've given it to them. If you look at the legality of it, it is very dubious. And we could be here all day speaking about the world of banking and banking conspiracies. Suffice to say, there is of course much more to say. And that all the time those at the tops of the glass towers have enormous amounts of money and don't share that with the rest of the world, there's always going to be a huge imbalance both of power and the haves and the have-nots. And of course, in modern terms, corporations also express this hegemony. And corporations and the establishment, well, they're basically one and the same. And things like the TTIP treaty, of course, will give enormous amounts of power to corporations and not to countries. And if you don't know anything about that, do check it out. Where Brexit leaves us on that is still uncertain. But TTIP is not a good idea for freedom. But let's go back again into history, because having all the money doesn't necessarily get you everything you want. You might have to manipulate events. Maritime events often get manipulated, as we saw with the original false flag idea. In 1915, a ship, the Lusitania, a British liner, but one that would often have many American people on it, would routinely shuttle back and forth across the Atlantic. And we were in World War I, of course. And whenever it came into British waters, warship escorts would come and they would guard the Lusitania into safe waters because there were U-boats abroad. But then one day, just as the Lusitania was coming into the area which was most dangerous, the warship escorts then peeled away. They were ordered away and Lusitania was left vulnerable. And within a few hours it was torpedoed, around 1,200 people died. Now, why was that ship left unguarded? And who would have given the orders to remove the escorts? Well, almost certainly it would have been the First Lord of the Admiralty that would have given that order. And back then, the First Lord of the Admiralty was Winston Churchill. Seen in the mainstream as, of course, a great hero of British life, but in the conspiracy world, often seen as a ruthless man, certainly a ruling elite operative. And it is interesting that shortly before the Lusitania went down, Churchill wrote to an aide, and in the letter he wrote, "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany. For our part, we want the traffic, the more the better. And if some of it gets into trouble, better still." So in other words, what he's saying is, we need a ship to go down. Because, of course, he wanted America to join the war. And it was not the only thing that brought America into the war, but certainly it was used. And this simple poster here, sorry, my clicker's been funny on me today. This simple poster here, saying enlist, with the mother and the baby drowning from the Lusitania, this was something which was very emotive. And in the end would build support for America to join the war, as they then, of course, did. So it's pretty obvious that certain events do get manipulated. And yet, it's a funny thing, isn't it? When the enemy do it, we're all happy to accept it. If it's on our shores, as it were, then we go, oh, no, surely we wouldn't do that. The burning of the Reichstag Parliament building in 1933 is often said to have been the moment where the Nazis rose to full power. Because at this stage the communists still held a lot of seats in the German parliament, but then they were blamed for starting this fire. They were blamed for setting light to the building. And then, of course, the Nazis got rid of the communists and came in. And yet you'll see many leading scholars today just accepting almost without question that the Nazis did this themselves, as they very probably did. But then, when you say, well, how do you know that this kind of stuff therefore doesn't happen everywhere? It's always, oh, well, they were Nazis. Of course they'd do that. We wouldn't do that. Yeah, right. And I'm afraid maritime disasters often bring this false flag accusation out. It is well known that the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, that ostensibly was seen to bring America into the war, was certainly suspicious. It's an interesting thing. At the time, we had another president, here we go, Franklin Roosevelt, cousin to Theodore, that we saw a couple of slides ago. He wanted America to join the war, but of course many American companies had links with Germany, and they weren't keen on war. And yet he did, and it's an interesting thing that the Japanese, of course, were being blockaded by America. America was very clearly antagonising them, almost guaranteeing sooner or later that a response would come. Because we're often given the impression the Japanese came out of nowhere and bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, that is not true. There was a build-up to this. And it is an interesting thing that intelligence reports had been made, and yet they were ignored. And it's not just a modern conspiracy theory. Vice Admiral Libby, who was one of the top US Navy brass at that time, was categorical that this had been allowed to happen. And he said, "I will go to my grave convinced that FDR, Roosevelt, ordered Pearl Harbor to let happen. He must have known." And you will find many other quotes from leading US Navy people. So it isn't just some modern conspiracy construct that has been applied to this. It was believed at the time. At the end of the war, or towards the end of the war, you get this interesting moment here where we have the Yalta Conference. Crimea is often a flashpoint in world history, and it certainly was an interesting moment here. So we had Churchill sitting next to Roosevelt, and there's Stalin. And this is often seen as the moment that the next few decades of the New World Order project are put into place. Britain was very weakened by the war, and this is seen as the moment where essentially the New World Order torch passes firmly to America. And then Russia is set up as the new big enemy, which if you've read George Orwell, and why not, if you haven't, you will know you always need a big enemy for us to be encouraged to kick against. It's a good way to keep the people in check. I'm not saying Stalin was a nice man, he was not. But he was, I think, foolish enough to play the game that was being laid out for him here. And many would argue that we're seeing the same thing being played out today with the new demonisation of Russia. So we see, again, repeating patterns. But wars, they're often manipulated, but sometimes you get a war based on nothing at all. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, it is often said, is what triggered the Vietnam War. Well, here are the only images we have of this alleged incident, a minor gunboat incident with the North Vietnamese forces and the US Navy. This happened virtually every week in those waters. But one night, the US Navy thought they saw on their radar, or their sonar rather, a big fleet coming towards them. And they couldn't be sure that it wasn't an enemy fleet, so they opened fire into the fog. It turned out there was no enemy fleet. It was just sonar echo. You can get that in certain weather conditions. So they radioed back to the White House, sorry, false alarm, there was no attack. Which is very strange, because the next day, knowing there'd been no attack, the US Defence Secretary Robert McNamara holds a press conference and says, we have been attacked, horrifically, in the Gulf of Tonkin. The President, Lyndon B. Johnson, often seen as dubious in the world of conspiracy history, was told in the middle of the night there was no attack. But he then made a big speech saying there was an attack. So basically, there was a very minor attack that they inflated in the public mind to give them the mandate for what then followed, which was, of course, many years of horrific war and much death and much mutilation, based essentially on nothing. They used this as an excuse to get everything that they always wanted all along. So I'm afraid this kind of thing seems to happen again and again. And speaking of dubious American presidents, I suppose we ought to mention this one. The Watergate affair is a famous conspiracy theory, and yet on the surface it looks like nothing. It looks like some bit of political espionage. But it's worth going a little bit deeper into this. Some people don't really get what Watergate was about. The essence of it is this. This is the Watergate office complex, so this is where we get that word gate appended to any perceived conspiracy in the mainstream. One night, this was the Democratic National Committee headquarters, Republican burglars were found inside the building, and it was never officially acknowledged what it was they were doing in there. But we'll come to that in a moment. Political espionage is not unknown. Presumably they were just trying to get some documents or something, but what? So where Nixon came unstuck was that he was accused of giving the orders for this burglary. Now that was never proved, but it was proved he'd known it had taken place and had then covered it up. And that's where he came unstuck, because being a paranoid man, Nixon had put recording equipment all around the White House without telling anybody. But when this became known, his own tapes with his own voice on it were sequestered by the courts in the Watergate investigation, and there he was making it very clear that he had known about the burglary. Now it could have been worse, because his secretary, Rosemary Woods, before the tapes got to the courts, would you believe, accidentally erased the 18 most important minutes. Well, would you believe it? And it's generally believed, had we heard those, there would have been a lot more damning stuff. So on one level it was bad enough for Nixon, he had to resign. But what was it really all about? Well, some years later, two of the men who'd been involved with this, Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt, both with CIA connections, one with mafia connections, they went public and said that the reason that they went into the Watergate building was to retrieve incriminating photographs that would have shown CIA involvement in the assassination of JFK. So that's their reason, they said, for why they had to go in. The photographs would have shown agents at dubious places in Dealey Plaza where the shooting took place. So the Kennedy assassination is, of course, one of the most famous conspiracy theories of all time. And I won't go into this deeply today, but it does encapsulate the kind of arguments we always seem to get. We have that phrase, lone gunman, where one person alone is blamed for doing something, seeming to mask a wider conspiracy. And that comes from the fact that, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald was accused of being the only man that shot the president. But even at the time, the Warren Commission, which is highly dubious, had to convince us that a very few bullets did a great amount of damage, and lots of ballistics experts say there must have been other gunmen present. You know, one bullet doing this kind of damage, and these arguments, of course, still go on. Channel 5 a couple of years ago tried to convince us that there was another gunman, and it's where one of the security guard's guns accidentally went off during the shooting. But that is widely seen as just yet another distraction, because there's a lot of evidence that there were other people who were more intentful than that, if you wish. Here is the grassy knoll. You'll often hear about the grassy knoll at Dealey Plaza. People here said they heard shots coming from over that wall. The police dicta belt recorders, so they were recording this on audio, record at least 6 shots. And this is still argued about today, not the 3 shots that we are told that Oswald fired. Now, we might have known more had it not been for the fact that, of course, Oswald was then shot dead himself in this horrible moment where a man called Jack Ruby walks out of the crowd, literally shoots Oswald dead point blank. So we never get to hear Oswald's version. But Jack Ruby himself is a fascinating character. Ruby, it seems, was set up to do this and had been told, if you do this, we'll let you off. You know, you'll be the great American hero for getting your own back on the gunman. But then, as soon as after it had happened, it clearly became obvious he was not going to be released. And when he twigged that he had been set up, he started to hold, believe it or not, press conferences from the jail where he was held. And he makes some really interesting statements. Here's one of them that he made in a recorded speech. You can hear it online. He said, "Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people who had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in the position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world." And a reporter says, "Are these people in very high positions, Jack?" And he says, "Yes." So in other words, he's saying there was a wider conspiracy, and he threatened that he was now going to spill the beans, but then was found dead in the cells. And he had already claimed that the doctors there were injecting him with something that he believed was there to kill him. And what's interesting is that other people have died who seem to have been interesting witnesses. This lady here, Rose Sharami, now she worked in Ruby's rather sleazy nightclub. On the eve of the shooting, she claimed that she had overheard Ruby and Oswald and men she believed to be CIA men discussing the shooting of the president that would take place the day after. So she claimed she overheard this. And she went to the police on the eve of the shooting and told them what she had heard. And they ignored her and said, "You're mad, go away." Well, of course, when the shooting then took place, she was left in a very difficult position, which is maybe why she was then found dead by the side of a road some short while later. And a number of other witnesses around the Kennedy assassination have died in strange circumstances. You often get that. 9/11, quite a few of the witnesses to that, they're now dying early of mysterious diseases and whatnot. So it looks dubious. It might interest you, though, to know that the official American verdict on the shooting of JFK is that it was a wider conspiracy, although most people don't seem to know this. They reinvestigated in 1979 and concluded there probably were other gunmen. But then they didn't go any further than that, and they left it there, and most people have forgotten that this document even exists. So we're clearly not being told the truth here. Who did it? Who really gave the orders? Here's the usual list. Cuban exiles, Fidel Castro, the Mafia, the Soviets, the bankers, the Israelis, the Freemasons, Majestic 12, the UFO group, of course, Black Ops military, and so on. Kennedy had just proposed a week or so before he was shot that the Russians and the Americans work together and exchange UFO information, by the way, and work on a joint space program. That's something else that some people think might have been the last straw and why they had to get rid of it. Anyway, the general view is, even if it was a combination of all these things, he was not playing the New World Order game. He was certainly not doing what had been expected of him, and he was putting noses out of joint left, right and centre and had to go. And someone else that often is seen as dubious is once again Lyndon Johnson, who of course had much to gain and would become president following the death of Kennedy. So, you know, there's much, much more to this, but it's interesting when you see how the pieces fit together and you see patterns that appertain also to other stuff that's gone on. As the 60s rolled on, of course, Robert Kennedy gets gunned down in an LA hotel in broad daylight. Martin Luther King is gunned down. And conspiracy theories soon arise around these. Who really did pull the trigger? Were there wider conspiracies to get rid of these people? Certainly it suited those in power that they were got rid of, that is for absolutely certain. And it started to make the public suspicious. And people then started, of course, to question anything and everything they were told. And especially when the Watergate story broke, the American public very quickly became very dubious about anything they were told. Which is why you start to get people quite early on questioning things even as seemingly solid as the moon landings. Now, tomorrow morning, Marcus Allen is going to give a whole presentation about the lunar landing conspiracies, and I am only going to skip through this today because he will cover that in more detail. The problem is that this is a growing theory. It hasn't gone away. At the last poll, 25% of British people don't believe we really went to the moon. They believe the pictures were restaged in a studio. And others say we did go to the moon, but what they found there they couldn't show. Maybe there were extraterrestrial bases there. Maybe what they saw was just not showable. Maybe we'd already been established on the moon for some years and this whole thing was a sham, that there is a secret space program, which many people believe that we've not been told about anyway. Well, take your pick. But what is clear is that many of these pictures are highly suspect. Here, this is one of the famous ones. Buzz Aldrin standing on the moon, and immediately there are anomalies. The visual record matters because we've only got 3 bits of evidence we went to the moon. The astronaut's testimony, but they could be lying. We've got moon rock, but they could have been brought back by probes. So you've mainly got the visuals. And therefore, if they don't stand up to scrutiny, there's your major evidence in big question. We've got the sun seemingly coming from behind Aldrin here, casting a jet black shadow. And yet his body's so well lit up, you can see all the detail. Why then can we not see any detail in the shadow? NASA says light's bouncing off the surface, filling in the detail. But if there's that much bounce light, we ought to see detail in the shadow, and we don't. You could raise the exposure of the camera. Then you'd see the detail on the body, but again, you'd see detail in the shadow. It's odd. And indeed, instead, what you can see is there's a bright patch of light there, which falls off into shadow in the background, and falls into shadow just a few feet in the foreground. This is on the moon. There's not even any clouds on the moon. It should be a uniform bright light, and it isn't. And many say this is a spotlight, and there's many other pictures with the same problem. Even the horizon line is wrong. When you zoom in onto the visor, you can see Neil Armstrong taking this picture with the camera strapped to the chest on flat ground. And therefore, the horizon must come through Aldrin's middle. You can pretty much demonstrate this was taken with a camera about 5-6 feet up looking downwards and was therefore not taken by Aldrin. Now, there are many other anomalies. There's another horizon anomaly, another shadow anomaly. There's the cameras. I'm sure Marcus will say more about this tomorrow. Very little protection against the extremes of light and heat and cold and radiation. Lots of radiation on the moon. How did the films come back without being fogged? How did the astronauts survive without dying early of cancer? There's a lot of questions that remain unanswered. But many say the pictures didn't come out, or they couldn't show what they found, and therefore they had to restage what they wanted the public to see in the studio. And there are certainly many anomalies. Here's the lunar lander. There's apparently the sun, jet black shadow. Again, what should be in silhouette is so well lit up, the astronaut's glowing. And indeed, the light source is coming in directly from the side. It's not coming bouncing off the surface. So this looks ever so like artificial lighting. There's never any disturbance. There's never any notable crater underneath craft that clearly came down on big jets. When you see the videos, you see a lot of dust blow up. And yet there's no evidence of that, certainly in the still images. On Mars a few years ago, the Curiosity rover was lowered down by a platform that hovered about 70 feet up, and the jets, even at that altitude, scalded the ground. But on the moon, nothing. On the moon, not even any dust has blown onto the feet of the craft. It's almost like someone vacuumed. Compare to another Mars lander, the Phoenix lander, showing kind of what you'd expect, dirt and dust on the foot there. So there's many things that don't quite add up. And something else is when you look at the visibility of rocket fuel in space. When you see the automatic shots of the lunar lander going up and the camera follows it up, you see the explosive bolts go off, but you then don't see any flame beneath it. You should technically, because this used exactly the same fuel mix that the shuttle used just a few years later, and when the shuttle fired its thrusters in a vacuum, it was very visible. On the moon, nothing. And of course many say it's a model shot. It's not even, in normal size. It's just a scale model. You could put all of this aside were it not for the fact that NASA has plainly faked some images. This is a classic Michael Collins spacewalking from one of the Gemini craft, so we were told. And yet then a few years later, somebody looking through the NASA image bank came up with this picture of Michael Collins in a test aeroplane, and they've clearly cut him out and stuck him on black. And if you can therefore make a fake image that cheaply and crudely, well, how can you be sure that all of them weren't done that way? And the answer is that you cannot. So more from Marcus about that tomorrow. But what I want to add here is this. The first man on the moon should have been Virgil Grissom, Gus Grissom. And yet he was very dubious about the technology that was supposed to get them to the moon. He was a very vocal critic of it. At press conferences, he even said to journalists, the odds of us getting to the moon are very slim. And he started to get, he says, death threats. And he believed they were coming from somewhere within NASA. And one day he said to his wife, according to his wife, if there is ever a serious accident in the space program, it's likely to be me. Well, strange it was then that Grissom and that entire crew there then died in the fire on the launch pad of Apollo 1. It was just a test, they weren't even going anywhere. And in a very ill-advisedly oxygen-rich atmosphere, a flame occurred and they were incinerated. Now, what I think is of note here is it was very early on seen as very likely to be sabotage. Many years later, Grissom's son, Scott Grissom, by now a qualified aerospace engineer himself, demanded to see the capsule in which his father died. And he discovered in the artifacts around it a little metal plate that had clearly been inserted into the dashboard, as it were, of the Apollo craft, the only function of which could have been to have created a spark which, in an oxygen environment, would have immediately set fire to it. And the Grissom family went public, and they have said, our father was murdered. And the NASA safety inspector brought in to investigate the fire, Thomas Ronald Barron, said the same thing. He investigated and immediately concluded this was sabotage. And he went further. In a 30-page report, he said, looking at the entire technology of the lunar missions, I cannot see how this is going to get us to the moon. And he was preparing a 500-page report that would back that up further when he and his wife died in a car crash, mysteriously. And mysteriously, the 500-page report was never found. So it looks as if there were people within NASA that knew something was amiss. But after a couple of deaths like that, well, 4 deaths, of course, anybody who was then going to start to call attention to these defects, of course, might then wonder, maybe that's not such a good idea. I am not saying that the people in mission control thought this was fake. Most people who worked on the lunar missions would almost certainly have thought it was real. But where were those signals coming from? You'd only need a very few people to set up a bit of scenery. And that is the problem. So, strange deaths, we have already established, often occur when there's something to cover up. Let's fast forward a few decades, because of course one of the famous strange deaths involves this lady here. I'm just using this as an example here of how actually the public is very keen on conspiracy thinking, right? So the mainstream doesn't reflect this in the media, but you look at the polls of what people believe and it's quite telling. So Princess Diana, it is now believed by around roughly 90% of British people that she was murdered and that the car crash was not an accident. So you may remember Princess Diana split with Charles and then started to make very sort of dark threats in these interviews. She was going to unmask the dark forces running the nation. She was going to tell us the truth about the royal family. Maybe not a wise thing to say. So therefore, the car crash occurs and she's neatly removed from being such a nuisance. So we're told it was a drunk driver. We're told this was the drunk driver, Henri Paul. There is no footage anywhere showing him inebriated. No witnesses say that on the night was he in any state other than normal. The blood sample, we're told, proved he was drunk, was plainly switched. Now, even the official sort of case accepts it accidentally got switched. But they said, yeah, but we retested and he was clearly drunk. Trouble is, the blood tests say, if it was his, he would have been so drunk he wouldn't even have been able to get out of bed that day, let alone drive the car at all. And indeed, on the eve of the inquest announcement as to what the verdict was, his family were told, your son will be exonerated. Literally, a day later, they blamed it all on him and the paparazzi chasing the car. But of course there's more to it than that. There was this weirdness of the white Fiat that clipped the Mercedes in the tunnel. And the French authorities said they couldn't find it because, oddly enough, all the CCTV in that quarter of Paris was off that night. So they couldn't trace it. Well, Mohammed Al-Fayed, whose son Dodi, of course, had just died in the crash, and a lot of people think Mohammed Al-Fayed's eccentric, but he had a right to want to know what was going on, hired private detectives, and they found that the Fiat very likely belonged to this man, James Andanson. And Andanson said it wasn't him there on the night, but then he would say that, wouldn't he, and so on. But what was odd was Andanson was then found dead in another car that had been burnt out, it had been locked from the outside, it had a bullet hole in his head, and his head had been decapitated within the car, and the inquest said this was suicide. I will leave that with you for a moment. So clearly there's something dubious, but the inquest, it doesn't look at this, it doesn't go any further with this. And yet, of course, it should. Here's the thing. Princess Diana predicted her death. She wrote to her butler, Paul Burrell. She said the same things to her solicitor, Lord Mishcon, and said there is a plot to kill me. And, well, the problem is that it does look like she'd got exactly what was going on. She wrote, this particular phase in my life is the most dangerous. My husband, she thought Charles was doing this, is planning an accident in my car. Brake failure and serious head injury in order to make the path clear for him to marry Tiggy, not Camilla. Camilla is nothing but a decoy. Tiggy Leg Book was the nanny to William and Harry. Sorry, we're going backwards again. And she, we'll get to her in a second, she, it is said, had an affair with Charles. That's not proved, but certainly Diana believed they were having an affair. There was a car crash involving Camilla shortly before Diana's crash, and Camilla ran from the scene, and when they asked her why, she said they were trying to kill me. Does anybody remember that? You won't hear much about that in the mainstream anymore. So it looks like somebody thought, we've got to take somebody out of this horrible quadrangle. Having failed with Camilla, maybe they then thought, oh, well, obviously, why don't we just get rid of Diana? That'll settle everything. Because she was now annoying many people. She was campaigning very successfully against landmines. And of course, she was going out with Dodi Al-Fayed at this time. Now, Dodi Al-Fayed, being a Muslim, of course, it is said some think they didn't want a Muslim bloodline coming into the royal family. Mohammed Al-Fayed says Prince Philip gave the orders to kill her. The answer is we don't know. But certainly there are many suspicious things about the Diana death. And one last thing about this. When she was brought into this hospital from the crash, she was alive, badly injured, but expected to survive. And the French doctors had her in a good state, but then the English doctors turned up and said, well, this is our jurisdiction, off you go, we'll take over now. Shut the door. and she was then dead 15 minutes later. And one of the French doctors thought that absolutely they'd done something very dubious or very stupid, and he was going to write a book about what he witnessed on that night, and was then killed in a strange car crash shortly after. So the same pattern over and over. And this, of course, all has resonance with another strange death, Dr. David Kelly, which immediately, again, the great British public immediately in their gut thought there's really something not right about this. And you will remember David Kelly was the source that spoke to the BBC. He said there were no weapons of mass destruction at a time when we were being told that there were. And then the Blair administration released his name to the public. He was embarrassed, he was hauled before various committees, and then he was found dead in the woods near his home. Well, there are so many dubious things about this. Even the MP Norman Baker, as he was an MP then, wrote a book saying Kelly was murdered. The wounds couldn't have killed him. There was very little blood loss, very little drug in his system. His body was provably moved from where it was originally found to where the police then photographed it. It looked like it had been redressed to make it look like a suicide scene. And the public mainly does not believe the official inquest. So they brought Lord Hutton in to sort this all out, and Lord Hutton, instead of saying, I will show you the medical documents that prove it was suicide, instead said, I'm going to put a block on it so we cannot see this evidence for 70 years. Well, that doesn't look suspicious at all, does it? And that's where it stands now. We've got another, 60 years to go before we can see these reports. So I think you can understand why people think this is highly dubious. And the whole bit about the war in Iraq and WMDs was all the spin-off from the whole war on terror thing, well, which of course in itself was a spin-off from 9/11. If there is a single person in this room that still believes the official story of 9/11, I urge you please to go and get educated. Because whatever really did happen on 9/11, the official story is a lie on so many levels. And I'm not going to go through it all today, but here's an interesting quote from David Rockefeller, who said, well, let's go back, who said, all we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order. And it looks to many like 9/11 was that major crisis that gave the mandate for control and the wars that would follow, and that the new world order needed this event and indeed ordered this event. The basics, the size of the hole in the Pentagon doesn't fit the plane that hit it. The flight path it took into the Pentagon makes no sense if the official story is true. The guy flying it could hardly fly an aircraft, according to official sources. There is overwhelming evidence that the collapse of the towers was some kind of demolition. Whether you go with the Judy Wood theories, whether you go with nanothermate, these are not natural collapses. And certainly the footage shows explosions going off in places that have nothing to do with the collapses going on at near free-fall speed at the top of the towers. These were clearly planned to come down. It is not a natural collapse. And of course the big one, building number 7, which never hit by an aeroplane, mysteriously did this. And anybody that's read the official report of why this collapsed will know it is scientific fraud. There is no way this building collapsed due to simple fires, because when you look at the fires that were in the building, they're too small, they're not in the right structural places. They are lying through their teeth about why this building came down. And of course, many believe 9/11 was coordinated from this building, not from a cave in Afghanistan, and they had to bring the evidence down at the end of the day. If you've not seen this stuff, and if you've not read all the questions, and there are many, go and find out. On my table upstairs, I've left some leaflets with some websites all about 9/11 and some other things. So have a look at the table upstairs and take a leaflet, because you need to know this if you don't already. And of course, here in England, we had 7/7, almost equally dubious. Who really were the bombers? Why did the train we're told they caught that day didn't run? Why is the CCTV coding all wrong? Why is there evidence that it looks like the images have been manipulated? This bomber here has got what should be a railing going behind him, going in front of his arm there. It's like it's poor photoshopping. There are many questions about the bomb on the bus, Why the bus drove to where it did that day? People on the train said the explosions came up from beneath the carriages, not from rucksacks above. There were exercises going on that day, as there were on 9/11, by the way, postulating exactly bombings in exactly the places they happened. Well, there's something highly dubious here. But we're told not to worry about it because there's no such thing as conspiracy, is there? And on it goes, I'm afraid to say. Bin Laden, was he involved in 9/11? Maybe, but if he was, I would suspect him and his bunch of patsies rather like the gunpowder plot. But of course some say he wasn't involved whatsoever. What 9/11 enabled the authorities to do was take away our freedom. The CCTV, the surveillance, that grip that is coming since. We've given away fundamental freedoms we used to take for granted. And now things that David Icke was saying 20 years ago are beginning to come true. Microchipping of the populations being now actually trialled in some nations. So we're now beginning to see things come true that conspiracy theorists said would happen 20 years ago. Well, now it's reality. And by the way, I mean, Bin Laden is an interesting character. Was he the man shot dead in his underpants? Yep, that's great, we're all on time. Was he shot dead in his underpants? Was that somebody else? Well, look at it this way. The SWAT teams that took him out have given very contradictory testimony about what happened on that day. Some of the people that could have told us the truth then all died in a Chinook helicopter crash. So now they can't tell us the truth. And on it goes. But if Bin Laden was the big bad wolf, well, was it this man that made him the big bad wolf? Zbigniew Brzezinski. Some of you will know this man. If you do not know this man, find out, because he is very big in your world, as I will demonstrate in a minute. Brzezinski went over with CIA men to Afghanistan in the early 1980s, and they armed the Mujahideen to fight the then Soviet occupiers. And of course the Mujahideen then gradually turned into Al-Qaeda, who turned into ISIS. And so basically the West created these very people we say are such a problem for us today. It is clear they're being funded by somewhere beyond their own means. Saudi is clearly involved, but the West is clearly involved. Again, George Orwell, you need a big enemy. You need someone to kick against. And these people, of course, have fitted the bill rather well. But Brzezinski matters because he's been one of the powers behind the Obama throne. And okay, this is all about to change into God knows what now, but he's been very powerful. He's seen as a political hawk. And when you read Brzezinski's books, he's very, very honest about what he thinks should happen. He's pro-New World Order. He's clearly one of the people at the core of it. This book here, The Grand Chessboard, written some years ago now, pretty much explores exactly what would follow. And he says, yeah, America should control the world. What's wrong with that? And some of the means that he proposes to do it make for very uncomfortable reading. Maybe the New World Order began as a good thing and it went sour. H.G. Wells clearly believed it was a good thing. But now it's fallen into totalitarianism. Now it's given power over to groups like this, the Bilderbergs and the Council on Foreign Relations, and groups that are unelected, they are undemocratic, they have huge influence over our lives, and we're told not to worry about them. We don't need to know what goes on. We don't need to say what goes on there. I would argue different. And of course there are then groups like the Bohemian Club, which has this ceremony once a year, the cremation of care, where rich and powerful people dress up in robes and worship giant stone owls and sacrifice effigies of children to them. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, is there? It's not denied, but it's not discussed. It's like it's a harmless pageant. Why do you need to know about that? Well, you could go deeper, of course. There's a lot of concern about occult agendas. There's enormous concern about child abuse agendas, which I'm barely going to touch on here. Suffice to say, get educated, because there is a dark cloud, which is, they're doing a very good job of making sure we don't investigate it, as you may have noticed. We know about it. People now turn up at the gates of Bohemian Grove and they protest, right? So it's not like it's a secret anymore. But maybe, of course, that's why there could be efforts to subdue us, to control us. The chemtrails mystery. Many think the atmosphere is being seeded with suppressants. Or is it climate control? Or is it something else? But the fact that so many people believe it tells you how wrong things have gone. Because we have that little trust in authority that we are happy to believe they might be poisoning us every day of our lives. That's how bad things have got, and it cannot continue. We also have things like HARP. This project began some while ago, which can now create fake aurora. It can send very deep sonic waves deep into the earth. And what's interesting here is, theoretically, it could trigger earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanoes, and some say it is, of course. It's basically a weapon that makes things look like natural disasters. But then do you even need that when you've got so many satellites above our heads doing things we don't even know what they're doing? In Brzezinski's book, he says we need a ring of satellites around the world beaming down things that affect people's brainwaves, and then we can control the population. This guy's running the world, right? Read what he writes. Now, let's hope they're not doing that, but the fact that they're clearly thinking about doing it means we need to know more. Some say, though, you don't even need that, because we're so neatly controlled and kept out of trouble anyway, and that actually the vast majority of the population just has no knowledge of these things. We're small enough to just keep out of the way, they can just ridicule us, they don't need to worry. And in fact, this is how we get portrayed. So anyone that challenges the norm is portrayed as a nutcase wearing a tinfoil hat. Apparently stops mind control. I've never tried it, but maybe I should. It's a brainwash. And if you believe in UFOs, you are described as a tinfoil hat and wearing nutter. Have you noticed that? It's a brainwash. Don't do it. And I can see Gary appearing, but it's all right because we're nearly at the end. I just need 2 minutes. Look at the mainstream. Right. Look at just mainstream things that have been revealed recently. The Hillsborough cover-up, Jimmy Savile, bank scandals, WMD. That's just on the surface. So you can imagine what's going on just below the surface. And the whole Edward Snowden business. Conspiracy theorists said we were all under surveillance. Nonsense! Now we just accept it's true. Those that are trying to reveal these kinds of truths are trying to do a good job. They're not trying to stir trouble for the sake of it. They're trying to make a difference to the world. And it may well be that this programme could be closed down if enough people stand up. And you good people here, you're already doing a fine job just by daring to be here talking about strange things flying around and beyond. It might well matter. Because if there are powers bigger than us beyond this planet, surely we need to be aware of what's going on there. And that's a whole tier that you are going to hear about throughout the rest of this weekend. So we're not told the truth, but take heart, because when you look at the polls of what the public believes, they kind of know it. They won't act on it yet. And yet, as mainstream media starts to get watched less and less, and alternative media or not so alternative media starts to become the main news source for many people, which is now what is happening, that imbalance, well, it's going to change, and you're going to find more and more people do become aware of this stuff. So when you leave this room at the end of this weekend, don't waste what you learn. Talk to people about it. Risk the ridicule, right? Cut through the brainwash. Tell them what you did and what you listened to and why you think it matters. Because everyone, if everyone were to do that, those with the knowledge, in the end the dominoes will tip. And this hegemony, this control, this brainwash will end. And you have to be optimistic, otherwise why bother? So go out there and do what you can. I hope this has drawn a few threads together, and I hope you're going to have a fantastic weekend. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. An excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Excellent. Like I said to you, this sets us up nicely because it's opened your eyes, if you weren't already aware, to many legitimate questions. We're not here over this weekend to preach to you to say you will believe in UFOs. But what we are going to do collectively is give you information. What you do with that information is down to you. But we are kind of like a source of reference, educators, if you will. But the fact that you're here is excellent. There's a lot of new people, never been to a conference. I think that lecture was outstanding because it makes you think. And there are so many things wrong with the way the mainstream media portrays information. And the general rule is, if it's difficult, we don't tell you. We don't lie openly, we just don't give you the information. It's done stealthily by omission and editing, clever editing. You can make us look like chimpanzees in a zoo if you want to through clever editing. Right, okay then, so you're into a 20-minute break now. A few quick things, just quickly. There's the vending area.